Hello everyone, I'm Nader Talebzadeh. Welcome to The Secret. From a hardline journalist managing several weekly magazines that were extremely conservative in ideology to a successful filmmaker holding numerous box office records, Masoud Dehnamaki has had a roller coaster ride of experiences in the world of media. Dehnamaki's film career overshadows his previous job as a journalist. His debut feature film, Ekhrajiyah, or The Outcast, in 2006 tells the story of Majid, a gangster from South Tehran who must reform himself in order to marry the love of his life. So he decides to head to the Iranian war front, and his protégés also follow him. This film set a box office record in Iran. His most recent film, Ekhrajiyah 3 or The Outcast 3 in 2011, is a political comedy portraying different campaigns for Iran's presidential elections. This film was highly controversial, and many critics believe the characters of the film were very similar to real-life figures. However, Dehnamaki denies this and considers himself an independent artist depicting the political and cultural realities of his country, Iran. This film, too, broke the record for the most selling film in Iranian history. Stay tuned to The Secret as I'll be talking to Masoud Dehnamaki. Thank you very much, Masoud, for taking part in this conversation. It's really an honor to have you here. I want to talk about your past. You began as a volunteer in the war in mid-teenage years, 15, 16, you were a volunteer in the war. You were in the front throughout the whole time. You wrote a book about it called Be Human, recently released, an excellent book. And then from there you went to become, after the war, you became a pretty controversial journalist. As the Westerners might label you an extremist journalist. And then after that, you became a very successful filmmaker. Your box office record has been the best in Iran. No one imagined you would become a controversial filmmaker that uses satire and comedy as his vehicle. I want you to reflect on this past and how you ended up in this position, how you came from there to here.
I would like to greet you and your viewers. Perhaps the social and political situation of our time, when the revolution became victorious, threw us, me and my peers who were 10 to 12 years old, into an environment that forced us to study and listen to speeches and actively take part in the political arena of the country. Later, when the war broke out, we went to the front lines to defend Iran. In reality, at the age of 12 or 13, to defend our beliefs, we had to read books whose terms we had to memorize on our way to school. At the time, different political groups were active. I recall repeating the word existentialism 100 times from home to school to only memorize it. This I did to use the word in a political debate at the age of 12 so that they wouldn't say those who defend the revolution were uneducated. I was at the battlefield for 3 years and sustained injuries. Then I became the commander of a battalion until the end of the war. When the war came to an end, I was thinking deeply that what would happen to the utopia and the cause for which we had been fighting. And I thought that it was my duty to take action to defend the cause for which we had fought and our friends had been martyred. Then I studied the beliefs of Imam Khomeini and his end-of-the-war message. I listened to the message many times. In the message, Imam Khomeini said, "Our war is one between poverty and richness, between the falsehood and the righteousness, between faith and faithlessness, and this war will not end." I felt after the 8-year war with the invading enemy that a new war has begun, and that's an ideological battle. From 1988, when the war ended, I engaged in political activities in the realm of justice and culture, and I thought, well, we have fought for many of these goals: decent management and the behavior of leaders and rulers. I thought today we should see such things come true in practice. When I saw these were absent, I thought I had to demand them. I took to the street and waged social protests, like the Hezbollah movements and street rallies. This time, instead of criticizing people, we began criticizing government officials. I mean, instead of confronting people over social ills, we had to confront policymakers and culture builders. Consequently, I concluded that the movement must not be limited to the streets, and it needs a theoretical backbone. I thought we need a media outlet. The mass media didn't pay any attention to our demands. They consider many of our words as extremist. And I launched a magazine. Prior to this, we distributed a pamphlet, and we also used the media during Friday prayers to make ourselves heard. Such moves drew feedback and responses. We used the media because we were being shown live, and when people saw us chanting slogans, they would say, "These words are new." I mean, prior to that, they would only say hi to the Friday imams and chant slogans against the US and the like. But these guys are chanting slogans for justice. Some people would even chant death to counter-revolutionaries. They thought that if you criticize an official, you are criticizing the revolution. But I said that is not the case, and that officials should not hide behind the revolution, and their performance and conduct had to be criticized. At the time, such comments were very special, and they even led to arrests, and they came and apprehended us, and we were held accountable. When I launched a magazine, I named it Shalamche, after the biggest battle between Iran and Iraq during the war. I began to raise my demands by using a harsh journalistic language. For the first time, the pictures of the martyrs and heroes of the war were published on the front page of the magazine in 4 colors instead of footballers and actors and the like. People would see such stuff. The weekly came to have the biggest readership in Iran. I mean, the number of the issues published from the 3 parts of the magazine, Shalamche, Jebhe and Dokuhe, was equal to that of all the magazines and newspapers of the principalist current. But we were different in that we promoted a new discourse. Our magazines would be confiscated one after another. I mean, one was published for a couple of years and it was confiscated after a lawsuit had been lodged. Then another magazine was published and confiscated. From one point on, I felt I needed to use a new language, because there were many similar magazines or newspapers. Many people released them using the same style. I made a documentary which criticized poverty and prostitution from the angle of justice. When I made that documentary, the New York Times ran a story calling me Iran's Michael Moore and drawing a parallel between me and him. And Japan's Asahi newspaper and many other foreign news outlets covered it. In Iran, millions of people found a banned network, unofficial media. This was because my film was banned, and that was the first time documentary cinema found a popular audience. It happened once before the revolution. I mean, documentary has no popular audience, most notably political documentaries. But this documentary had a million-strong audience, and I think the justice discourse had an impact on the result of the 2005 presidential election. The presidential hopefuls at the time contacted me and called on me to make their ads with poverty and prostitution being their theme. I told them their lifestyle did not match the definition and said to them that they needed to move from northern Tehran to southern Tehran. Well, this film had the largest audience in the documentary section in Iranian history. I took the next step towards the war cinema and turned my memories of the wartime into a trilogy. The Outcast 1, The Outcast 2 and The Outcast 3. They were not just my memories, but were also my demands and thoughts. The Outcast 1 was on the war and different people in it, and I turned a chapter of my own book into the film. In The Outcast 2, I addressed the issue of prisoners of war, and it was part of the history of the war. And The Outcast 3 was on veterans who had returned from war and are placed in the middle of political and social environment. This was kind of a critique of democracy and its tenets, of which I was critical, and also a critique of the rule of money during elections, as well as chicanery and hypocrisy. Each movie faced its own challenges at the time of screening, and some foreign media outlets like the BBC and VOA aired hours of programs against the movies.
In your past, the time that you were a journalist when you were bringing out the magazine Shalamche, Christian Science Monitor came to Iran several times and they interviewed you. A specific writer did that. And I was always interested why the Christians in Christian Science Monitor would be interested in a devoted, religious sector of Iran society and a religious person who was a volunteer during the war at a very early age, and now as a prominent journalist with a weekly magazine, which outsells everybody else. This is even before you became a well-known filmmaker. And then, of course, when we followed CNN, you would see that their main anchor, one of their main anchors, Amanpour, would come to Iran and interview you. It was surprising to many people why they found that there's somebody that's different. Talk about how the West has approached you.
Well, this is in part due to tribunes that were critical of administrations at the time I published the magazine, whether it be the Hashemi administration or the Khatami administration or the next ones. I mean, I approached issues from the criticism of performance angle, and as I was a media man, the world media that came to make reports inside Iran would also look at us. But I was not a mouthpiece for any political faction or current, and I just had my own views. Yes, when CNN's Christian Amanpour came to Iran for interviewing the president or other sitting officials, she and others would also interview me. Perhaps gradually those who thought the way I did felt that their statements should not have been like a bulletin or an inner discourse, and that they should speak journalistically and talk to the world. As a result, this way of thinking increased. As for the movies and the Christian Science Monitor, when Mr. Scott Peterson saw my movies, they likened me to Oliver Stone, who had been in the war, just as they had drew a parallel between me and Michael Moore after seeing my documentary. And they said, look, someone who was in the war is making a movie on the war. I think their view of our war cinema was correct. And they said, some of you intellectuals are only faking the intellectuality of the Western cinema and Hollywood. They make anti-war movies while everybody knows that your war was a defensive one, not an aggressive one. How come they make anti-war movies? This is ultimate backwardness. It has nothing to do with intellectuality. They said what they thought was that the real symbol of the events of the war were in my movies. That's why they came and interviewed me and made reports, and this drew international reactions. As you know, the world media do not make reports as ordered by others, and you cannot get them to make reports on your work or my comments. They just did that due to the importance of the movies, as they had triggered a discourse and were impressive. When I launched the magazine, pro-establishment press were not like that. Making such comments are now normal in society. Or the subjects in my films, or the political issues. I make my movies to defend the revolution, not to reject it. Many could make films against the revolution. But sometimes you make them to defend the revolution and are both attacked and welcomed. The foreign media coverage was very interesting to me. For example, I learned that in Britain my interviews were collected and turned into a book, without even me knowing. You were also aware of one of them and informed me.
I'm going to go to your first successful film, Ekhrajiha, or translated perhaps as The Ousted. And it's based on your memories from the war, where you were like a teenager and you had to fool around with your father to allow you to mess around with your national card to be able to have enough age to go to the war. And it's also a comedy. It's a very successful comedy. And because anyone who volunteered in this war would know that in the operations, it was actually a very festive mood. Everybody was very lighthearted. And this film turned out to be extremely successful in terms of box office. It broke all records of box office. You who were never trained as a filmmaker and never went to film school outdid all those who had been to film schools. And I want you to talk about that experience.
Well, it's interesting. I think it should be recorded in the Guinness Book of Records. There is no filmmaker in the world whose 4 or 5 movies have been the best-selling in a row in his country. There might be 1 or 2 movies, but there is no filmmaker whose 4 or 5 movies have become best-selling. But it's interesting. I made 4 fictional movies, except for my documentaries, that have become bestsellers of the year according to figures released by Iran's cinematic organization. That is nothing but a blessing from God. In the last chapter of my movie, I thought that when the war ended and when the veterans were returning from the front lines, they would be welcomed by people, like what we see in foreign movies that show people showering them with ribbons and the like. That's what I thought the end of the war would be like. But in our country, this happened gradually, and we didn't know about that, and our propaganda system didn't know this. This was a war that we won. They sought to partition our country through the war, but they failed. We didn't know how to change this victory into an opportunity. And when I returned from the war, I saw people were living their normal lives. I felt sorry, not for myself, but for the generation who made all those sacrifices. I made the movies at a time when the war genre did not have a big audience. 20 years had passed after the war, but when the movie The Outcast came, people made a connection with it. Now the protagonist of my film is one of the most popular personas of the Iranian cinema, and an ordinary war veteran is even more popular than our generals. Now, after 15 to 20 years, when they conduct a survey, they find that it's still very popular, and this makes many sad. They just say, this happens. But The Outcast 1 was distributed among people before being screened, and as a result, the box office was not that high. But The Outcast 2 brought millions of people to movie theaters, and people sang the "Oh Iran" song alongside the actors in the movie. It was interesting to me. What I had been waiting for 2 decades after the end of the war was happening in cinemas. Cinema has that capability. I think the Los Angeles Times ran an editorial at the time of the movie and said, "This movie changed our calculus regarding the analysis of the Iranian people." It said that they thought 20 years after the war, when a generation had changed, they would face veterans in a war. But the movie proved that in the event of a conflict, young Iranians would once again defend their country against the foreign enemy, regardless of their affiliations. Now, if a movie can make that single achievement, I think it's a masterpiece. But I did not make it. God helped us do it.
As we're speaking, your next film is going to be screened during the Eid vacation, the Nowruz vacation. And it wasn't shown in the Fajr Film Festival. You didn't send it to the Fajr. It's called The Prisoners. What's the theme of this next one?
My first 4 movies, namely the Outcast trilogy and the Mi'rajiha, were of the war genre. The movies Scandal 1 and Scandal 2, as well as Prisoners, which is my last film and is hopefully going to be screened in a few days, are mainly on ethics in society. They address ethics and spirituality in a humorous way. Scandal 1 is about people's prejudgment on others. I mean, an entire society could judge someone mistakenly. Scandal 2 is also of the same theme and shows the mistakes of people and officials and their negligence as well as corruption, which all trigger an earthquake. Now, this earthquake means social ills and the collapse of ethics. There was a serious warning in the movie that addresses the notion of awaiting.
In the usual film festival that Iran has, which is the Fajr Film Festival, many films go to film festivals, Berlin, San Sebastian, Cannes, etc., etc. But none of your films are selected by these festivals. Although when the Western media comes to Iran, CNN comes to Iran, Los Angeles Times comes, Christian Science, they come and hunt you down, they sit down and talk with you. Why are they interested in you, and why is not the cinema tech or artistic cinema or the usual norm that they're attracted to Iranian cinema, why are your films always boycotted? Almost always.
Well, that is mostly because of the content of the films. They understand the movies, and that's why they do not like them. They know about the movies, and they are not uneducated. There is a side-taking aspect and intra-discourse criticism in the movies. As a result, they try to turn a blind eye to them. On the other hand, as you know, they promote movies and their heroes just for political reasons. That is also the case here. We are facing such a problem in our own festivals, too. They are unable to come to terms with this aspect of my movies that are made by someone who is not a graduate of the cinema university and whose films enjoy a high box office. And the best way for them is to ignore him. I think a characteristic of cinema is that it's like a creek and makes its own way, most notably in this new world. When the new media and the social media come into being, there is no empire in the world that can impose its decisions. Yes, some movies may fail to be seen in the world movie theaters. But now, with the new social media in place, well, they have filled this vacuum.
You know, you've written a book that recently came out. It's your autobiography. It's called Be Human, or Be a Man, or Be Real, however you want to translate it, Adam Bash. It's a long book. It's about 400. It's your autobiography of the war, as a war witness, as a teenager, and it goes into great detail. It's a very beautiful. I could never lay it down. Whenever I opened it, I could not lay it down until I had read several pages, and it's just very attractive. I wish that it would be translated well into English, because if the Westerners read your book about what happened in the war, really happened in the war, I think they'll step back a few more steps. I want you to comment on this book.
Well, I can say that I divided my life into several decades. For example, the first 20 years cover the revolution and the war. When I was 20, the war came to an end. I was active in the realm of politics and media in the next 10 years. At 30, I entered the field of cinema and documentary. I've been in the field for 10 to 15 years now. But in several days or a month, when I enter my 50s, that will be the decade of the output of my studies throughout the past years. It's about 100 volumes of books. Be a Real Human is the last one. That's my memoir. But I have written 80 volumes of an encyclopedia of captivity in war. There were 40,000 Iranian POWs at the Iraqi camps. The encyclopedia is the biggest war reference in the world. It's being given to the publisher and has yet to be released. I have also authored 2 volumes entitled Tayyib Khan, who was an icon before the revolution and was martyred in 1963. I have also written 3 volumes entitled The Operational Record of Hamza Battalion. That's a daily record of a battalion. I was in the battalion myself for several years, from the beginning to the end of the war. That's an oral history of the birth of a battalion in the war. I mean, in the books you can see the war from the perspective of the battalion. On religion, I have also written a book entitled Effects and Blessings of Salawat. From the age of 50, I will mainly focus on religious books, and I plan to author such books until I turn 60 if I survive. As for Be a Real Human, yes, it's my memoirs about the war. It has a second volume on my political activities, and the third one is about my cinematic work. They are 3 volumes. People have liked it, and those who did not see the war have got in touch with the book. I plan to get it translated and get a foreign publisher to publish it, and I hope they will welcome it abroad as well.
Thank you very much for this conversation. It was very enlightening, and I wish you the best, and we wish to have you back again on the program. Well, that's all for this edition of The Secret. I'm Nader Talebzadeh. Thanks for watching.